that's what we have in the modern rite. Perhaps we could speak of some influence of Gregory in the development of the rite, or maybe he was mentioning a custom which was in his extant in his church, and however, no text of prayer survived from this period, and hence no fixed text at this period. What exception we have the Acts of Thomas, as we already mentioned, but we remember what the prayer, what it ended up with. It actually ended up in the bride and groom decide not to actually become married in the traditional sense, but rather to maintain virginity. So, in patristic evidence from the West, testifies that at that point the rite of ecclesial blessing included the prayer of the priest and rite of joining right hands and communion. And the customs in the West also vary. That, for instance, in Gallican customs, and that is referring to the area of France, does not foresee foresee clerical participation, with the exception of blessing the chamber of the newlyweds. And in North Africa, at the beginning of the 5th century, bishops participated in the signing of contract, in the signing of marital contract, but nothing more. And thus, by what is important for us to see that by the 5th century, where we have established custom with the of clerical participation in the marriage, with the Eucharist as a main element. When we go to the Byzantine rite of marriage, as I say, 6th to the 11th century, we have already in the 6th century, we have evidence of some prayers which later entered into the Byzantine rite of marriage. For instance, the prayer, one of the prayers of the rite of betrothal, and one of the prayers which today is part of the rite of crowning. They are mentioned in the Kontakion on the wedding of Cana by Saint Romanus, the Romanus the Melodas. Another description from 582, we have a description of the wedding of the Emperor Maurice in the Palace of Daphne at Constantinople. What do we have there? We have a patriarch who conducts a solemn service where he joins the hands of the emperor and his bride and crowns them and gives them communion. And then they proceed to one of the halls of the palace. The emperor takes the veil off the bride, and the wedding hymn is sung. There is a common cup and a marriage feast. And also the Theophylact Simocata, who describes it, says that the crowns or wreaths were not put upon the newlyweds, for this was already done during the service. Hence the conclusion from this is that's probably for the common people, not imperial couple. The crowning or wreathing was probably done at the wedding feast and not yet in the church. But what is important for us is that at this point we have evidence that there was a communion in the church, and that there was also a common cup at the marriage feast. So one of the claims of the early scholars that common cup is a replacement for communion. It's kind of a kind of remnant of communion. It's not exactly accurate. It's not evidenced by the sources. What we have rather, we have a communion in the church as a part of a marriage rite, ecclesial rite of marriage, and then we have a common cup at the marriage feast. Theodore the Studite in the 9th century already mentions the sacred prayer of crowning, which corresponds to the contemporary prayers. If you have on your handout, it would be a prayer 3, and also a prayer which I did not include in the handout, but I'll mention that. So the prayers 3 and another prayer. Not on the handout, considers the most ancient core of the rite. Theodore the Student also calls the marriage mystagogy, and as we know it's term which has certain Eucharistic connotations, and he also argues that people who marry the second time should not receive the sacramental blessing, since it incurs the excommunication for 1 or 2 years. So he says, why would we conduct a marriage rite if they are to be excommunicated because they marry second time for a certain brief period of time? But what it demonstrates, his argument demonstrates that for him the communion was an inalienable part of the rite, and so since these people cannot receive communion, so receive the Eucharist, they at least at this point, at the point when the marriage is conducted, they cannot be married, because there is no there is no marriage in the church without the Eucharist. There is no sacramental marriage without the sacrament, the Eucharist. So by the end of 8th century, when we have a first manuscript evidence of the Byzantine Euchologion, dated about around, say, 795 or something, we have the first manuscript text of the prayer of the betrothal and the prayers of crowning. And mandatory for legally contracting the marriage, the church rite of the marriage becomes only at the time, as I've already said, at the time of the Emperor Leo the Wise, in Novella 74, 89, and afterwards in the 11th century, this specifies that the church blessing at the betrothal and marriage is mandatory, and in 1092 it also starts including the slaves. So finally, when we get to the very rite of marriage, as it appears in today's liturgical books, and if we look at it sort of throughout its historical development, we see that we see a great diversity in the different liturgical manuscripts, and as it is true for any liturgical rite in the Byzantine world, the standard text of the rite emerges only as a result of the printing of books. When we get people to print books, that's how the standard text appears. But it doesn't mean that there were no common elements among the rites. It just means that there could have been local customs where the marriage rites the prayers could have been different. However, that does not mean that that there were no common features, that it was so diverse that there wasn't nothing in common. So there are common features. The common characteristics would be that there are essentially three parts to the rite: betrothal, crowning, prayers for the removal of the crowns, and or blessing of the bridal chamber. Usually, a betrothal is a separate rite, but in practice it was done at the same time as crowning, and already in the 15th century. We have different titles for betrothal. We have sometimes it's called either betrothal or the pledge, which would be a term for the exchange of the giving of the wedding gifts. So that we have right of betrothal, right of the wedding gifts. And from the 10th century, it would include also introduction of the Great Litany, and would include also other prayers. And we have invariably in the rite of the betrothal, we have a prayer which I did not include in the handout. But which I will read to you. Prayer of the betrothal 1 would be, O eternal God, who has brought into unity those who were sundered.